Here are 5 notable green Pauper commanders that you can play with at any moment you want to. Generous Visitor is a spirit, and I love this little guy. You know, except for his creepy mask, but its ability is quite good. Whenever you cast an enchantment spell, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature. So we'll of course put in a bunch of enchantments to get the deck running. Master Chef is a fantastic one in this deck just for the extra counters on all our creatures, and Generous Visitor only being 1 mana is incredible. So this can almost always happen. There's so many land auras for extra mana that we can use, like Dawn's Reflection and Fertile Ground, or cards more like Grafted Growth for even more +1/+1 counters, or even Font of Fertility for just direct land stuffs. Jukai Preserver can put more counters on things while also being an enchantment, and Nylea's Forerunner provides the enchantment bit while also granting all our creatures trample. I could see this in going 2 ways. Make this a +1/+1 counter Voltron deck and swing with Generous Visitor, or use a bunch of enchantment creatures and such to make an army and swing with large and in-charge creatures. I don't know, either way it's pretty fun. Serin Steel Seeker, I will admit this is not the strongest card in the world, but I really like the utility. Whenever an artifact enters the battlefield under our control, we'll look at the top card of our library. If it's a land, we can reveal it and put it in our hand. If we don't put it in our hand, we can put it into our graveyard if we'd like. This deck could run a bunch of cheap, useful artifacts and some creatures that use the graveyard. Ichor Wellspring and Mycosynth Wellspring are 2 great examples. And Mirror Retriever or Workshop Assistant get your milled cards back from the graveyard to trigger Steel Seeker again later. Using the graveyard, we could insert the 4 cards that have Delirium for graveyard synergies: Backwoods Survivalists, Kessig Dire Swine, Might Beyond Reason, and Moldgraph Scavenger. Or even the cards with Threshold for their synergies and buffs. Excavating Anerid and Far Wanderings being a couple that work really nicely. Blossoming Wreath is another hidden gem that works really well, gaining life for the number of creatures in our graveyard. We'll also be constantly ahead with lands due to the commander's ability, and being able to essentially surveil as long as we can cast an artifact can be very valuable throughout the game. We'll probably want to go wide as the win con, using a bunch of creatures that might not be strong, but put in lots of them. Maybe even use the cards with Fabricate to make extra things, for example, like Tima Outrider or Iron League Steed. These would also trigger the commander's ability, making the cycle continue. Aftermath Analyst. Alright, you know I'm a sucker for big stompy creatures. This deck can facilitate the end by milling cards and then returning lands from the graveyard. When Aftermath Analyst enters the battlefield, we'll mill 3 cards. And then you can pay 3 and a green and sacrifice it to return all lands from our graveyard to the battlefield tapped. We'll load this deck up with creatures like Blanchwood Prowler, Eccentric Farmer, Moldgraph Millipede, and Patient Naturalist. These will allow us to fill the graveyard as well with all the lands we'd like. After our graveyard is loaded, we'll activate Aftermath Analyst's ability and return all lands from our graveyard to the battlefield tapped. Then it's time to cast some giant creatures. Annoyed Altasaur and Maelstrom Colossus come to mind to cascade into various things. You can also run Colossal Dreadmaw, Duskdale Worm, and Rust Goliath for big boys to trample down the board. But what I like about this build is that you can go wide or go tall or kind of do whatever. Green allows you to grab a ton of different things, and I just think that's amazing. I was looking through even more cards, and you could go with a life gain sub-theme with Ravenous Lindworm, Hill Giant Herdgorger, and Honey Mammoth. And if creatures go to the graveyard, we can just run Survivor's Bond, Evolution Charm, and Wildwood Rebirth. This makes the deck annoying, and just because we've got a ton of land, we can just keep doing things over and over again that are harder to deal with. I just think this could go off hard and be really fun if you're just in the mood for a stompy deck. Wandering Troubadour. If you've ever wanted a dungeon deck in PDH, here's a fairly good one. At the beginning of your end step, if you had a land enter the battlefield under your control this turn, venture into the dungeon. This is so incredibly easy to trigger in green. We just run a whole bunch of ramp, trigger this on our turn every time, and use the dungeons to our advantage. Dungeons in and of themselves aren't that strong, but because we want to drop lands every turn, why not turn this into a landfall dungeon deck? We'll run Territorial Scythecat and Spore Mound, then run Kazandu Nectarpot and Jaddy Offshoot for life gain. This may be a little one track with just being a landfall deck, but I think adding the dungeon mechanic to it could make it really interesting. I don't know, what do you think? Alright, lastly we've got Druid of Horns. Boy oh boy, this one is one of my favorite Enchantress Commander cards in general. Whenever you cast an aura spell that targets Druid of Horns, create a 3/3 green beast creature token. This is a really cool Voltron type deck. Attach all our cool auras to Druid of Horns to make it bigger, while kinda going wide at the same time. And a 3/3 for 1 mana with Rancor just seems to fit nicely. There are currently 86 auras that you can attach to Druid, so you've got a lot to choose from. For me, I'd probably use stuff like Regeneration for, well, regeneration, Bestial Bloodline to give a buff and to be able to return it from the graveyard, and Cartouche of Strength for the fighting 2-for-1. But like I said, you could have any combination of these that all work fantastically. I'll throw a few more options out there just to be fun. Ferocity makes our commander bigger whenever it attacks or blocks. Frog Tongue draws a card and gives it reach. Treefolk Umbra grants it the ability to assign combat damage equal to its toughness rather than its power. And this might be niche, but I think it's really cool. Street Savvy gives the ability to block creatures with any sort of landwalk ability. Not good all the time, but it still gives a +0/+2 boost. So in conclusion, there are a ton of really cool mono green Pauper commanders out there that could really be fun to play. Let me know what your favorites are, and if you need any of these commanders, click on the TCGplayer affiliate link below. And while you're down there, if you need a playmat, click on the Milkman Proxy link as well. They sell fantastic proxies and playmats, and let me tell you, they're extremely great quality. Thank you so much, and I'll catch you next week for your weekly dose of Magic.